She was 31 years old and she had nothing left, not a roof to sleep under, not a name that still carried credit at the general store, and not a single soul in the county of Harlan Flats. Wyoming who believed she would survive the coming winter. The man who had taken everything from her was not a stranger. He was her late husband's brother, Aldous Cree, who had presented a document, forged or otherwise, before the county judge in September of 1887, claiming that the farmstead, the cattle, the seed reserves, and the household contents of Eleanor Marsh had belonged to the Cree family estate since before the marriage and were therefore subject to reclamation. Eleanor had stood in that courtroom with $43 and a wool coat and watched 12 years of her labor change hands without so much as an argument heard in her favor. She used 31 of those $43 to purchase a thing that made the men of Harlan Flats town square laugh so openly that 2 of them had to remove their hats and wipe their eyes. She bought the old Alderton schoolhouse, the one that had been shuttered since the schoolmaster left in 1879, for the sum of $30. Pressed into the hands of the county land clerk like it was the most serious transaction in the world. $1 she spent on bread and salt pork. The remaining 11 she folded into her boot. They laughed, those men. They laughed because the building leaned. Because the roof had holes. Because no one had opened that door in 8 years. None of them knew what was sealed behind the chalkboard wall. None of them knew what was waiting inside the dark, quiet bones of that building, a secret old enough to rewrite the history of Harlan Flats itself. And just enough to give a whole forgotten community something they had nearly stopped believing they deserved. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Marsh. If you have ever felt written off by a place that should have known better, tell us in the comments. We read every single one. Eleanor was born in the spring of 1856 in a farmhouse outside of Laramie, the second of 5 children born to a woman named Ruth Danforth, who had come west from Ohio with a school primer in her traveling trunk and an unshakable belief that letters were the most portable form of freedom a person could carry. Ruth Danforth had herself attended only 4 years of formal schooling, but she had spent the remaining decades of her life teaching herself botany, bookkeeping, basic surveying, and enough Latin to read the inscriptions on the medicine bottles she sold for a season out of a wagon when the crops failed. She was not a woman who sat still inside the borders of what others had decided she was allowed to know. Eleanor inherited this from her mother the way some children inherit a jawline or a temper. It was simply part of the shape of her, visible early and permanent. By the age of 9 she had read every book in the farmhouse twice, including the surveying manual and the family Bible. By 11 she was helping her younger brothers and sisters with their arithmetic, spreading corn husks on the floor and scratching numbers with a charred stick when the chalk ran out. She had a particular gift for making things clear. She could take a tangled idea and pull it straight with the patience of someone who genuinely believed the person in front of her was capable of understanding, given enough time and the right words. Her father, James Danforth, was a quiet man who grew wheat and respected silence. But he recognized what his daughter had the way a farmer recognizes good soil, not with poetry but with a practical certainty. He allowed her, at 13, to walk 6 miles into Laramie once a week to borrow books from the reading room above the land office. He allowed her, at 15, to take over the teaching of her youngest siblings entirely, using a slate board he nailed to the interior barn wall for the purpose. He never said he was proud of her in so many words, because he was not a man made of words, but he kept the slate board clean of cobwebs every single week for 6 years, and Eleanor understood this. She married Thomas Marsh when she was 19 and he was 24, and this is not a love story in the swooning sense. Though there was genuine warmth between them, a mutual recognition between two people who worked the same way, who believed in the same proportion of labor to rest, who did not need to fill every silence with noise. Thomas had a homestead claim in Harlan Flats, a stretch of Wyoming land that was dry and difficult and not what anyone would call forgiving. He had cattle, 23 head when they married, and a house that had been built by his own hands from timber dragged by mule over 4 miles of broken ground. He was not a man of great ambition or great failings. He worked hard. He came home. He died of a fever in the autumn of 1883, quickly and without drama, the way the land itself sometimes took things, without warning and without ceremony. Eleanor was 27 years old. She had no children. She had a farm. What she did with that farm in the 4 years between Thomas's death and the day Aldous Cree walked into a courthouse with his forged document is worth understanding. Because it tells you exactly what kind of woman this story is about. She did not sell. She did not remarry out of necessity. She hired 2 young men from town, the Pratt brothers, who were 17 and 19 and willing to work for fair wages and meals, and she ran the cattle operation herself. Keeping the books each night at the kitchen table by lamplight, recording every head, every pound of feed. Every penny of debt and income in a ledger she kept in a locked tin box under the floorboards. She was methodical. She was not spectacular about it. She simply did not stop. By the end of 1885 she had increased the herd to 41 head. She had repaired the barn roof, dug out a second well, and put aside enough reserves to carry the farm through 2 dry seasons. The Pratt brothers had both grown into men during those years. And they were loyal to her in the particular way that men become loyal to someone who pays them fairly and speaks to them directly and does not pretend to be more than what she is. This was Eleanor Marsh. This was what Aldous Cree took from her on a Tuesday morning in September of 1887 with a piece of paper and a county judge who had known Aldous Cree's father since before the war. We have to speak plainly about the fall, because it deserves plainness. It was not a sudden catastrophe or a dramatic unraveling. It was a document, and a courtroom, and a judge who did not look Eleanor in the eye once during the entire proceeding. Aldous Cree was the younger brother of Thomas Marsh. Thomas had taken his mother's surname, as he and Aldous shared a father and different mothers. And there had always been the particular friction between them that exists when one brother works and the other watches. Aldous had visited the farm twice during Eleanor and Thomas's marriage. He had eaten at her table. He had slept in her spare room. He had looked at the cattle and the repaired barn and the second well and said nothing, but Eleanor had felt the look, the way you feel a hand checking the weight of something it intends to pick up. After Thomas died, Aldous had come once, briefly, and suggested that Eleanor might find it easier to sell the property to him and move back to Laramie. Eleanor had thanked him for his concern and said she intended to stay. He had not pressed. He had simply nodded and ridden away, and she had thought that was the end of it, and she was wrong. The document Aldous produced claimed that the Cree-Marsh family homestead had been filed under a joint patent agreement between the elder Cree and the elder Marsh in 1871. Before either Thomas or Aldous was of legal age, and that upon Thomas's death without surviving children, the land reverted to the Cree estate. Whether this document was genuine or fabricated she never entirely determined. The judge accepted it. Eleanor's counterargument, that she had improved the property substantially and maintained it in good faith, was acknowledged and then set aside. Wyoming territorial law in 1887 was not a generous instrument where widows were concerned. She was given 30 days to vacate. She spent those 30 days making sure every one of her obligations was settled. She paid the Pratt brothers their full wages and wrote each of them a letter of character reference in her own hand. She gave the farmhouse kitchen goods to the Pratt family, who were good people and had fewer things than they needed. She packed her own personal belongings, the school primer that had been her mother's, a surveying manual, her own ledgers, a change of clothes, a hand mirror, and a winter coat, into a single leather satchel. She withdrew what money remained from the savings kept with the Harlan Flats bank, which amounted to $43 and some cents after the final land office fees. And she walked into town on the last day of September and stood on the main street of Harlan Flats in the thin autumn light and understood that she was beginning again from nothing. She did not cry in public. This is not because she did not feel the weight of it, the grief was enormous. The kind that sits in the chest like wet earth, but because she had a practical nature and public tears had never seemed to her a useful expenditure of energy. She noted what she had. She began to think. The old Alderton schoolhouse stood at the north end of the main road, just past the feed store and before the land turned to open scrub. It had been built in 1872 by a committee of 4 families who believed Harlan Flats was going to grow into something, and it had, modestly, for a few years, until the schoolmaster. A man named Cedric Alderton, who was well-meaning but could not endure the winters, packed his things in the spring of 1879 and left for a teaching post in Denver. After that the school had simply sat. The town had talked about opening it again every year and every year had found reasons not to. The door had warped in its frame. The windows had gone gray with grime. 3 generations of swallows had claimed the eaves. The county land office listed it for $30, which was not its value but was the sum someone had once assessed for the land it stood on, and no one had ever offered even that much. Because no one had looked at the building and seen anything other than a liability. Eleanor looked at it and saw walls. A roof. A door that locked. A floor. She paid the $30 on the 1st of October, 1887, signed her name to the transfer deed, and walked into the building for the first time carrying a candle, a broom, and her leather satchel. The men outside the land office, she could hear them from the open window, were laughing. She set her candle on the teacher's desk at the front of the room and stood very still and let her eyes adjust. The room was long and low-ceilinged, with 8 rows of double desks, most still intact, scarred with the initials of children who had sat there 15 years ago. The windows were grimy but whole. The stove in the corner was rusted but structurally sound. The chalkboard at the front of the room was large, larger than she expected, stretching nearly the full width of the front wall. The slate face still carrying the ghost of a long-erased arithmetic problem, numbers that had been washed away so many times they had pressed themselves into the surface like an impression of memory. She was still looking at the chalkboard when she noticed that it did not sit flush against the wall. This was not immediately obvious. The board was mounted on a wooden frame, and the frame was mounted against the plaster wall behind it, and at a glance everything appeared as it should. But Eleanor had spent years keeping accounts, which meant she had spent years noticing when things did not quite align. The left edge of the chalkboard frame stood perhaps a quarter of an inch proud of the wall, and when she leaned close and held her candle to the gap, she could see that behind the frame there was not plaster, or rather, not only plaster. There was a seam. A vertical line in the wall, deliberate and straight, that disappeared behind the board. She pressed her hand flat against the chalkboard frame and pushed gently. There was resistance, and then a faint click, and the entire left half of the frame swung inward, not the chalkboard itself, but the wooden panel behind it. The one that the slate had been mounted to, and behind it was a space. Not a room. More than a space behind a wall, less than a room. Perhaps 2 feet deep and 5 feet wide, the height of the wall itself, running the width of half the front wall. And in this space, in the absolute stillness that had accumulated there since 1879 or before, were stacked, carefully, deliberately, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against damp, a collection of objects that Eleanor could not immediately make sense of. She stood at the opening for a long moment, candle in hand, and then she set the candle down on the nearest desk and reached into the darkness with both hands. The first thing she drew out was a wooden box, roughly 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, locked with a small brass latch that was not, in fact, locked. The mechanism was simply stiff with age, and when she worked at it with a hairpin from the collar of her coat it gave way without much resistance. Inside the box was a collection of papers, folded carefully and held together with a length of plain cord. She carried the box to the desk, set it next to the candle, and unfolded the first document. It was a land survey. Hand-drawn, meticulous, dated 1871, the same year, she would later realize, that the Alderton schoolhouse itself had been built. The survey described, in careful ink lines and notations, the full extent of Harlan Flats and the surrounding township. And it had been executed, she could see the signature at the bottom, by a woman named Clara Voss. Eleanor had not heard this name. She read it twice. She looked at the survey again, at the precision of the draftsmanship, the careful angles, the notations in a hand that was small and even and unhurried. And she thought of her mother's surveying manual and the way Ruth Danforth had once told her that surveying was the act of saying, "I was here, and this is exactly what I saw." She set the survey aside and unfolded the next document. It was a letter, addressed to no one in particular, written in the same small even hand. The letter was dated September of 1878, and it began, "If you have found this, then the school is gone or the school is empty, and I am likely gone too. And what I have kept here deserves a better keeper than a sealed wall." Eleanor read the letter twice, and then a third time. And by the time she looked up the candle had burned down a significant length and the light outside the grimy windows had shifted toward the blue of early evening. Clara Voss had been a surveyor. Not an amateur, not a hobbyist, a professional, trained by her father, who had worked the same trade in Pennsylvania before coming west. She had arrived in Harlan Flats in 1870 and immediately recognized what no one else in the newly forming township had yet grasped, that the land the original families were filing their claims on was, in several key places, misdescribed in the territorial records, which had been copied hastily and inaccurately from an older Mexican land grant survey that used a different meridian baseline. The errors were not small. They meant that 4 family homesteads in Harlan Flats had been paying taxes on, and in some cases feuding over, land that was not accurately described in any legal document the territorial government held. Clara had tried to bring this to the attention of the Territorial Land Office. She had written letters. She had prepared documentation. She had been, by her own account in the letter, treated with the particular polite dismissal that was the standard response to a woman presenting technical information to a room full of men in 1871. The land office had thanked her and done nothing. A local land speculator named Horace Greer, who was, by the time Eleanor read this, long dead, had told her she was welcome to pursue the matter further if she liked. But that the territorial office had no mechanism for accepting survey corrections from private parties, and particularly not from parties without an official license. And that her best course of action was to go home. She had not gone home. She had instead done what she could do. She had completed a full and accurate survey of the entire Harlan Flats township, documented it as precisely as she knew how, and hidden it, along with the original erroneous territorial survey she had obtained through means she did not specify in the letter. Though Eleanor suspected bribery or borrowing, inside the space she had constructed behind the schoolhouse chalkboard. Because she had built the chalkboard wall herself. This was in the letter too, almost as an aside. She had volunteered to fit out the schoolroom interior before Cedric Alderton arrived. And she had used the opportunity to construct the hidden space with the help of her brother, who was a carpenter, and who had since moved to California and was, she suspected, unlikely to think of it again. She had hidden the survey because she believed that someday, when the territorial errors caused enough damage, disputes, lost claims, unjust taxes, someone would need the correct version and she wanted it to exist. She had hidden it in the schoolhouse because she believed the schoolhouse would endure. She had addressed the letter to no one because she could not know who would find it. But she had also hidden something else. Beneath the papers in the wooden box, wrapped separately in a layer of oilcloth so fine it might have been used for a wedding dress, Eleanor found a second document, not a survey this time, but a deed. A private deed, drawn up between Clara Voss and a man named Ferdinand Bauer, dated 1874, for a parcel of land that included, Eleanor had to read this carefully. Tracing the description against the accurate survey she now held, the eastern water rights to a spring-fed creek that ran through what was currently, in 1887, the property of 2 families and 1 territorial grazing reserve, and whose ownership had been disputed in the local court twice in the past decade, expensively and inconclusively. Because no one could produce documentation that predated the territorial error. Clara Voss had been holding the original deed in trust. The letter explained this too, in a passage that Eleanor read with growing astonishment. Ferdinand Bauer had asked Clara to keep the deed safe because he did not trust the local bank or the court. And he had died in 1876 of a riding accident before he could retrieve it, and his family, the Bauer family, who still lived 12 miles outside of Harlan Flats, had spent 11 years believing the water rights had been lost. Eleanor sat in the gathering dark of the empty schoolhouse and understood what she was holding. She was holding the correct shape of Harlan Flats. She was holding the truth of who owned what, who had been taxed wrong, who had lost what they were owed. She was holding, in the Bauer deed, something that would settle a water rights dispute that had cost two families years of legal fees and genuine hardship. And she was holding, in Clara Voss's survey, something larger, a document that, if accepted by the Territorial Land Office and applied properly, would correct the foundational errors that had skewed every subsequent claim and tax assessment in the township for 16 years. She folded everything carefully. She put it back in the box. She sat on the floor of the schoolhouse in her wool coat in the October dark and did not move for a long time. Then she lit a fresh candle from the stub of the first one, opened her own ledger, and began to make notes. She did not go to the courthouse immediately. She was not impulsive, Eleanor Marsh. And she knew that a woman presenting a hidden survey and a lost deed to the Harlan Flats County authorities without preparation was likely to receive the same polite dismissal that had been given to Clara Voss 15 years earlier. She needed allies. She needed witnesses. She needed someone the court would listen to before they had the opportunity to decide they would not. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne was the proper authority, and she knew this. She also knew that she could not walk into Cheyenne carrying papers from behind a chalkboard wall and expect to be heard on the strength of her word alone. She needed a surveyor, a licensed, practicing, officially recognized surveyor, to examine Clara Voss's work and attest to its accuracy. She found one in a man named Augustus Fell, who operated out of Casper and had a reputation as the most precise and least corruptible surveyor in the Northern Territory. She had heard his name once, years before, from a land agent who had mentioned him in the context of a boundary dispute south of Laramie. She wrote him a letter from the schoolhouse, using the teacher's old desk as her writing surface, and she described what she had found, not in vague terms, but precisely. Because she understood that precision was the only currency she had. Augustus Fell wrote back in 10 days. He would come. He was, he said, curious. In the weeks between sending the letter and his arrival, Eleanor worked on the schoolhouse. She patched the two worst holes in the roof with timber scraps she traded for by offering to keep accounts for the feed store owner. A transaction she proposed directly and which he accepted with the slight air of a man who has been surprised by a reasonable offer. She cleaned the windows. She repaired the stove. She set the desks back in their rows. She was not preparing to sell or to abandon. She was preparing to stay, and staying required the place to be livable. Word traveled, as it does in small towns, that Eleanor Marsh was living in the Alderton schoolhouse. The responses were various. The Pratt brothers, both of them now working other claims, came by to check on her and brought a sack of cornmeal, which she accepted without embarrassment. The wife of the feed store owner brought a wool blanket, folded and left on the step without a knock, which Eleanor found one morning and understood to be a particular kind of quietly offered kindness. Others simply watched. The men who had laughed in the town square continued to find the situation amusing, though their amusement had the edge of something slightly uncomfortable in it now. Because Eleanor Marsh did not appear to be suffering in the way they had expected. Aldous Cree heard that she had purchased the schoolhouse and rode past it twice on the main road, slowly, looking at the windows. Eleanor watched him from inside and said nothing. She had not yet decided exactly how she was going to proceed, but she knew that how she proceeded mattered, not just for her, but for the Bauer family. For the Homestead families whose tax records were wrong, for Clara Voss's work, which deserved to be correctly acknowledged and used. When Augustus Fell arrived in November, he was a tall man of about 60 with the deliberate manner of someone who has spent decades measuring things and knows that the virtue of measurement is in its slowness. He examined Clara Voss's survey for 3 full days, cross-referencing it against the territorial records, comparing it against his own readings taken in the field. Speaking very little and writing a great deal. On the fourth day he sat across from Eleanor at the teacher's desk and told her that Clara Voss's survey was not only accurate, it was, in his professional opinion, exceptional. The kind of work he would expect from a licensed surveyor with 20 years of experience. He also told her that the Territorial Land Office was legally obligated to review and act on a corrected survey if it was submitted with a proper attestation from a licensed practitioner, which he was prepared to provide, and that the process, while slow, was not optional on the office's part. The question was whether Eleanor was prepared for what would follow the submission, an audit of 16 years of land records in Harlan Flats Township, reassessment of tax records, and the probable reopening of at least 2 property boundary disputes that had been filed and then allowed to lapse. Eleanor said she was prepared. She was also, she told him, prepared to address the Bauer deed separately, to contact the Bauer family directly before any official submission, so that they would not learn about the recovery of their document from a government notice, but from her, in person. Augustus Fell looked at her for a moment and then said that in 40 years of territorial survey work he had not frequently encountered someone who approached a situation like this one with this degree of care for the people who would be affected by it. He said it plainly, not as flattery but as an observation, and Eleanor received it the same way. She rode out to the Bauer family 12 miles before sunrise on a morning in late November, the ground frozen and the sky still full of stars, carrying the deed in the wooden box wrapped in her wool coat. The Bauer family, 3 adult children of Ferdinand Bauer, now in their 30s and 40s, opened their door to her with the wary politeness of people who have learned to be cautious about strangers bearing documents. She sat at their kitchen table and placed the deed in front of them and told them, as clearly as she knew how, exactly what it was and where it had been and how she had found it. There was a long silence. Then the eldest Bauer, a woman named Greta, who had her father's strong hands and the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for something without quite believing it would come, put her face in her hands and wept quietly for a moment. Then she looked up. She thanked Eleanor in a voice that was very even and very serious, which was its own kind of dignity. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne received the corrected survey, the attestation of Augustus Fell, and the full documentation from Clara Voss's sealed cash in December of 1887. The process that followed was not fast. Land processes are rarely fast. But it was inexorable, because Augustus Fell was right. The office had no legal mechanism for ignoring a properly submitted, professionally attested survey correction, regardless of how inconvenient the correction was. The audit of Harlan Flats Township records ran through the winter and into the spring of 1888. It confirmed that 4 homestead families had been paying taxes based on misdescribed parcels. 3 of them received adjustments in their favor. The 4th, a family named Greer, descendants of the same Horace Greer who had dismissed Clara Voss in 1871, discovered that their claimed acreage was smaller than they had believed and that a parcel they had been treating as their own for 9 years had in fact belonged to one of the other 3 families all along. This was addressed through the courts in a proceeding that was unpleasant but not prolonged. The Bauer water rights deed was authenticated and returned to Greta Bauer and her siblings at a formal proceeding in January. The water dispute that had cost their family years of legal fees was resolved by the simple existence of the document Clara Voss had kept safe. The creek ran where it had always run. Now the papers said what the water already knew. Through all of this, Eleanor kept the books. She had proposed to the county, once the audit was underway and the scope of the records work became clear, that she be engaged as a records clerk for the duration of the process, given that she had intimate knowledge of the original documentation. The county had agreed, partly because it was practical and partly because the auditor from Cheyenne, a thorough woman named Mrs. Hartley, had recognized in Eleanor's ledgers the same quality of mind that Augustus Fell had recognized in Clara Voss's survey. Eleanor was paid a clerk's wage for the duration. It was not a large sum. It was enough. By the spring of 1888 she had enough to properly repair the schoolhouse roof, replace the broken window sash, and purchase a new chalkboard, not to cover the hidden space, which she left open and visible now as a kind of testament, but to hang beside it on the adjacent wall, clean and ready. She reopened the Alderton Schoolhouse as a school in April of 1888. She sent notice to every family in Harlan Flats Township. School would be held Monday through Friday, morning to midday, for children between the ages of 6 and 14. There was no charge for tuition. Eleanor lived simply, and the clerk's wage, combined with small contributions from the families who could afford them and did not make it a condition for those who could not, was sufficient. The enrollment on the first morning was 9 children. By the end of the month it was 17. By fall it was 23. She taught arithmetic the way her mother had taught it, with patience and with the foundational belief that every child sitting in front of her was capable of understanding, given enough time and the right words. She taught reading and penmanship. She taught, in the upper grades, basic surveying and land measurement, the practical mathematics of knowing where you stood on the earth and what that meant. She told them, without ceremony, that a woman named Clara Voss had surveyed this entire township before most of their parents had arrived here, and that the work Clara Voss had done had protected 4 families' land and restored a water right that had been lost for 11 years, and that this was what accurate knowledge could do in the world. She framed Clara Voss's original survey. Augustus Fell had helped her obtain a careful copy on proper paper, and hung it on the wall of the schoolhouse beside the open space behind the chalkboard frame, where anyone who wanted to could look at it and understand. Aldous Cree lost the farm. Not immediately, and not through any direct action of Eleanor's. The property boundary audit determined that a section of the Marsh homestead, the section that abutted the Pratt family's claim, had been incorrectly described in the original filing. And the corrected description, when applied, shifted the formal boundary in a way that placed 2 of Cree's cattle sheds and the access road to his west pasture on land that legally belonged to the Pratt family. Cree attempted to contest this. The territorial record, now corrected and attested and formally adopted, did not accommodate his contest. The Pratt family, who were decent people and bore Cree no particular malice, offered to sell him the right-of-way for the road. The negotiation went poorly because Cree conducted it the way he conducted most things, as though the other party's needs were an inconvenience he was not required to fully acknowledge. The Pratts eventually declined to sell. Without access to the west pasture, the cattle operation was not viable. Cree sold the farm in the autumn of 1888, at a loss, to a young couple from Nebraska who knew nothing about its history and who were, by all accounts, good neighbors. Eleanor learned about the sale from Mrs. Pratt, who mentioned it in passing while picking up her youngest son from school one afternoon. Eleanor acknowledged this and moved on to the next thing she needed to do, which was to help a girl named Addie Schultz understand the concept of long division. This was more interesting to her than what happened to Aldous Cree, and she allocated her attention accordingly. We began this story on the main street of Harlan Flats, in the thin October light, with a woman who had $43 and nothing else and a building that leaned and a crowd of men who found the whole situation very funny. We began it with Eleanor Marsh pressing 30 of those dollars into the hand of a county land clerk and walking into a schoolhouse that smelled of dust and old timber and the particular absence of children who had once been there and were no longer. We began it with a chalkboard. And what was behind it? What we want to say now, having told you the whole of it, is that the value in the Alderton Schoolhouse was not only Clara Voss's survey, though that was real and consequential and changed things in Harlan Flats in ways that can be measured in legal records and corrected deeds. The value was not only the Bauer water deed, though that was real too, and the Bauer family's relief was real. And the sound of Greta Bauer crying quietly at her kitchen table in November and then lifting her head and looking at Eleanor with that very serious expression of dignity, that was as real as anything in this story. The value in that building was also this: a woman named Clara Voss had believed that accurate knowledge deserved to be preserved even when the people in power did not want to receive it. She had built a wall behind a chalkboard to keep that knowledge safe. And Eleanor Marsh, who had been told by the people in power that she did not have the right to the life she had built, had looked at a leaning building and seen the same thing Clara Voss had seen, that walls could hold more than they appeared to, and that what was hidden was not gone. The schoolhouse is the story. Eleanor Marsh is the story. And the story is the same one it has always been, told in 10,000 versions across the long westward reach of this country, that what is overlooked is not always without worth. And that the people who are written off have a way, sometimes, of doing the writing. We want to thank you for spending this time with us, and with Eleanor, and with Clara Voss, whose name deserves to be said out loud one more time. Because she did her work and kept her word and left something behind that mattered. If this story moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need it today, someone who is in the leaning building stage of something, who cannot yet see what the walls might be holding. Leave us a comment with your answer to this. What is something you once found, or were given, or stumbled into, that turned out to hold far more than it appeared? A place, a person, an old object, a forgotten skill. We would genuinely love to know. And if you have not yet subscribed, this is a gentle invitation to do so. We tell one story at a time, slowly and carefully, and we would be glad to have you with us for the next one. Until next time, stay close.